Call on Mike Canty to introduce our speaker. From the crowd that we've got here today, I think we've got an expert, and people know and realize who an expert is. So it's so good to have our very good friend, but I'm not going to say his name, okay? I'm calling on Mike Canty.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for the great turnout. It's really very heartening to see so many people. It's really a great privilege and an honor to introduce Professor Marean. I heard about him through the late Angela Embleton, I think, that was trying to get him to come and talk to us. And then he did talk, was it 2 years ago, Curtis? Yeah, 2 years ago he spoke at a separate venue, which was very well received. But I also have a private interest in paleontology and early modern human beings, and came across the article in 2010 of Scientific American, which spoke about his work at Pinnacle Point, and more importantly about the theses that he drew from that, from the evidence. So I then got his CV, which ran to 35 pages, and I thought, well, we can spend the whole day reading through the CV and all the citations, the honorary awards, the professorships. He's been honored by his peers in the Archaeological Society of the United States. So really, it's not difficult to sing his praises. And even so, last night we had dinner together, the committee and Curtis, and I was so impressed by the scope and scale of his intelligence with regard to the mastery of not just one discipline, but many disciplines, sufficient to draw much larger conclusions than a mere cave in the southern cave. I think that for me, it is a serious honor and a privilege to ask Professor Marean to address us on the subject before you. Thank you, Curtis.
Well, thank you very much for having me back again. I had a wonderful time last time I was here, where I spoke at Cambrogi at the barn. What a great venue that was, really unique. But I've actually been coming to Plettenberg every year since 1999, when I started working at Mossel Bay. And I normally take the students on the Robert Trail Walk, and then we end at Nelson Bay Cave, and I give them a lecture on the cave. So it's great to be here to meet the community and talk to you about our research. And the talk I'm going to give today is going to differ quite a bit from what I talked about at Cambrogi. We've had some really new, spectacular findings that we published just in March of 2018. I'm going to end my talk on that and explain, some of you may have read about that in the newspapers, so I'm going to explain why that was significant and what we hope to do going forward. But I'm going to begin my talk with an overview of what we know about modern human origins. And that's a subject that really changes weekly. And it changes weekly because we're making enormous strides in the study of ancient DNA. And that's having huge impacts on what we know about human origins. So I think I'll probably say some things that you're going to find kind of surprising. And then I'm going to review, after I give you the up-to-date knowledge on modern human origins, I'm going to review some of the ideas that brought me to the South Coast, why I'm here doing this research, and some of the updates. And my team has just completed a 10-year research trajectory investigating what we call the Paleogallus Plain, which was the land surface, the landscape that was exposed during lower sea levels. And I'm going to give you an update on what we found. And we have just this year a special issue of a very prominent journal that's covering all of our research on it. So we have 22 scientific papers in that special issue, and so that one issue of that journal will be all about our work. And I'm going to hopefully summarize it all for you very quickly, right? And then we'll move on to that final new research that we just published. Okay. So this is the slide that I'm going to use to update you on what we know about the origins of us, right? And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the World Heritage Site, the Cradle of Humankind, up north. That material focuses on the earliest phases of human evolution, 3 million, 2 million. And what we do here on the south coast in the Cape is we work on the transition to us, to modern humans. So it's a very different story. And many of you may know that we are in the final phases of submitting a World Heritage nomination to UNESCO for our sites on the south coast. That's been a 10-year effort that began in Mossel Bay with a meeting that we had of scientists in your World Heritage Committee. And we are now at the point where the final proposal is being, all the I's dotted. And we hope to submit it in February of 2020. And I'm confident that will get approved. And at that point, Pinnacle Point will be a World Heritage Site. And that's going to have huge impacts on the South Coast, positive impacts in terms of the quantity and quality of the tourists that come here. So let me give you the background of why these sites would be considered worthy of World Heritage status. On the lower axis, I have a world record of temperature change. So when that line is up here, the world is warm, and when that line is down here, the world is cold. So glacial, cold, interglacial, warm. And that comes from the Epica ice core in Antarctica, where we can generate really highly resolved records of temperature change. And that record goes back to 800,000 years ago. So that axis is in thousands of years. And there's one take-home message, at least, that I want you to see, is that through most of the last 800,000 years, the world was substantially colder than it is today, right? The world was mostly in a glacial, and then we have very short periods of interglacial conditions within those that punctuate those glacial phases. And of course, we are in the Holocene right now, and we are very rapidly driving that temperature up with the impact of humans, faster than what has ever occurred in the geological record. And then, if we go back to this point right here, 700,000 years ago, I've broken the world's lineages into two lineages, a Eurasian archaic lineage and an African archaic lineage. So these are human lineages, one lineage living in Africa, one in Eurasia, and the only contact point between them is the little space of the Sinai in the Negev desert going out of Africa and into the Levant. That's the only place people can walk in and out of Eurasia and Africa. And what we know, mostly from the genetic record, is that from about 700,000 years ago to about 400,000 years ago, there was quite a bit of gene flow between those two lineages. So people were moving in and out of Africa and Eurasia at that time and exchanging genes. And when there's gene flow between populations, they don't speciate, so they don't break into separate species. So the fossils that we find in Eurasia and Africa at that time, they look pretty similar. Now, what's interesting is, right at about 400,000 years ago, that gene flow gets cut. And it is probably cut because the Sahara forms. And the Sahara becomes an impenetrable barrier to people moving in and out of Africa. And of course, the Sinai and the Negev deserts are just extensions of the Sahara. So people can't cross. Now, when you have a cutting of the gene flow, the species begin to break apart, right? Because they're not being maintained as a single species. Okay, around 300 to 200,000 years ago, there's a lineage that lives, that we know mostly from Eastern Asia, called the Denisovans. And they split apart, okay, and become their own recognizable lineage. And then, of course, shortly after that, the Neanderthal lineage, which lives mostly in Western Eurasia, splits off. So at that time on the planet, we had at least three lineages: Denisovans in Eastern Asia, Neanderthals in Western Eurasia, and the African archaic lineage here in Africa. And then we know, right between 200,000 years ago and 150,000 years ago, the modern human lineage splits apart from that archaic African lineage. And that's the lineage that gives rise to everybody alive on the planet today. Okay, so when these lineages end in a circle, that means they end in extinction. And when they end in a line, that means they're still here today. And of course, we're still here today. Then, around 70,000 years ago, an incredible event happens. A small population of Africans, right, modern human Africans, exits out of Africa, and that is the founder population for all Eurasians. All Eurasians are descended from that founder population. Eurasians and Africans. And interestingly enough, as they leave Africa, they encounter Neanderthals, and they interbreed with them. And the end product of that interbreeding is that all Eurasians alive on the planet today have a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genome. And it varies from about 2% to 5%, something like that. And if you had your genome sequenced, they'd be able to tell you how much of you is Neanderthal, right? Africans don't have that DNA. And then there's this extraordinary event where that founder population moves to the west, and it moves to the east, and it radiates, and it gives rise to the extreme diversity of modern human lineages and ethno-linguistic groups that we see today. So for example, Melanesians, Aborigines, and so on, the people who live in indigenous inhabitants of Australia and Papua New Guinea, break off and become their own lineages. And the reason I point to them is because their shared common ancestor met Denisovans and interbred with them. So that all the indigenous Australians and Papua New Guineans have snippets of Denisovan DNA in them. So an Australian has a little bit of Neanderthal and a little bit of Denisovan. But if your lineage comes from Western Europe, probably no Denisovan, but definitely more Neanderthal. And then, interestingly enough, there was an archaic African lineage that was still hanging around Africa after the movement out of Africa at 70,000, and the African lineage interbred with them. And I have those arrows pointing because what that means is that's the direction of gene flow. And in the sciences we call that introgression. It's movement of genes from one population into another. So the story, the take-home story that I want you to know is that, you know, as recently as 70,000 years ago, there were many lineages of near modern humans all over the planet, and today we only have one. But we have clues of those other lineages in our genome. And as that genome is being studied, we are learning what those genes did. So for example, we know that a lot of the red hair in Eurasians comes from Neanderthals. There is an adaptation to high altitudes of the people who live in Tibet, and that comes from Denisovans. And we will know very soon what most of those genes that were retained did positively for our populations. Okay. Now, if you remember, I told you that all modern humans, the modern human lineage, arises sometime between 200,000 years ago and 150,000 years ago. So this is a close-up of that climate record that I just showed you. Okay, glacial down here, interglacial here, 200,000 years ago and 150,000 years ago. And look, 200 to 150,000 years ago, the world was in one of its coldest, longest phases on record. It was a very strong glacial phase. Much of Europe was covered by an ice sheet at that time. And we call it marine isotope stage 6. Okay, so if you can remember stage 6, I might mention it a few times in this talk. And just remember at stage 6, very hard glacial phase. Now, Glacial Africa, between 195 and 130,000 years ago, Ka is an abbreviation for thousands of years, looked very different. The Sahara was twice as big as it is today. Okay? The Central African rainforest was restricted down to little tiny refuge pockets at that time. And much of Central Africa was a grassland instead of a tropical rainforest. And we know that the Cape Flora region, this region, was pretty much, in terms of its vegetation, the same as it is today. Because climate here has been very resistant to climate change for a long time. And I can't get into the details as to why that is, but that's something that our research group has been working on for about 10, 15 years. And we've learned quite a lot. Now, some of you may know, and I think that was circulated, I published a series of papers where I argued that during this phase, there were probably 4 to 6 potential zones in Africa where there were refuges for populations that could be the origin population, the progenitor population for everybody alive on the planet today, right? Because if you've been following me, the origin population occurs here. So it's got to be one of these. And the genetic diversity of all modern humans is really small. So that suggests that it's not all of them, but it's just one of them. And I argued that this population was the most likely candidate for that progenitor population. I'm going to briefly explain why I made that argument. Okay? I wrote a scientific paper on this, and I also wrote a paper for the general public that became very, very popular. It was on the cover of Scientific American, Secrets of Our Success. And why did I argue the South African coast? I argued that because the region, I think, provides a uniquely rich and stable food source. So that's why you have a refuge here for these glacial populations. And that richness and stability provided a refuge during harsh glacial phases because it didn't change, right? It was always stable. And we have good reasons to think that it was stable. Okay, now, most of you probably know that the vegetation here is very unique. It is so unique that the world is recognized as having 6 floral kingdoms, and you're your own. That little slice of land right there is its own floral kingdom. And it's for a couple of reasons. One is the diversity of plants here is super, super high, way above what it should be. And most of them are endemic, so they're only found here. So that's why it's defined as its own floral kingdom. And one of the characteristics of the Cape Floral Kingdom is it has a very high species diversity of what we call geophytic plants. These are plants with underground storage organs. And the reason I've put it on this graph is that regions with Mediterranean climates, so in other words, strong winter rain, have lots of geophyte species. And normally, species diversity is a function of area. Okay, so that as area goes up, you get more species. The bigger the region, the more species. So on this graph, I have area. And look at Chile, California, Australia, and the Mediterranean basin. These are Mediterranean zones. Okay, they follow that rule, pretty nice. But look at the Cape. It demolishes that ecological rule. 2,400 species of geophytic plants out of the 10,000 species that you have roughly from Cape Town to PE. Pretty extraordinary pattern. And what I argued is that early modern humans used these as a primary food resource because it's a nice big carbohydrate package. The other thing that makes your area particularly rich is you have a collision of a cold current, the Agulhas current coming down from the tropics, colliding with the Benguela upwelling, and that mix of cold and warm water creates a lot of diversity in terms of oceanic habitat, and that creates an extraordinarily rich intertidal zone and fishing zone, which many of you probably already know this. And if modern humans could exploit that, they have a rich source of food through those glacial phases, because glacial climate changes don't depress oceanic productivity. They depress terrestrial productivity, but not the ocean. Okay, so once people figure out how to exploit the mussels and the limpets and so on, they're going to have a very rich source of protein. Now, I've talked about that. That's basically the focus of the Scientific American paper. But we're going to add, so if you think about the seafood and the geophytes as food on a table, the table has two legs, right? It's got the geophytes and it's got the seafood. I'm going to add a third leg now. And this is something that we've learned recently. There's a paleontological puzzle here in the Cape. And that puzzle is, during modern periods, the Holocene, your feignboss is dominated by little buck, right? Dikers, Kreisbach, stuff like that. But in the Pleistocene, so just 15,000 years ago, it's dominated by these kinds of animals, which you don't find in the feignboss. Wildebeest, zebra, grass-eating species, which obviously the feignboss doesn't have a lot of grass unless you force it on it, like if you turn around and see the grass out there. That would disappear very quickly if it wasn't maintained, right? So we have this paleontological puzzle. Why are there all these big grazing animals, some of which are now extinct? There was a giant buffalo that stood this high at the shoulder, and its horns would reach from that part of the wall over to here, out like this, obviously not living in the forest. It's extinct now, but it lived out there around in this area 12,000, 13,000 years ago. So we just, there's a magazine that's published by your Department of Science and Technology that they send out to high school students. And we partnered with them to write a special issue on what that looked like. How did that environment look? You can see on the front cover they called it Unlocking Pinnacle Point, the Paleogallus Plain, an ice age refuge for Homo sapiens. And if you're interested, we can circulate that to you. It's pretty well done. I like the way it worked out. But here's the answer in a nutshell. This is a model of the coast today. Okay, so Mossel Bay would be right about here. This is what it looked like 18,000 years ago during a full glacial. There was a 95-kilometer distance between Plettenberg Bay town today and where the coastline was at that time. And it was a large, flat plain. So 10 years ago, we initiated a multidisciplinary study to build the ecology of that plain. And I'm going to summarize for you what we found. It's summarized in here, and we have a special issue of the scientific journal coming out that has all the meat, all the scientific meat. So we partnered with a number of people, and one of the key scientists was Dr. Haley Cawthra. Haley was a young South African graduate student when I first recruited her to the project. I saw her give a talk and I said, I've got to have her on my project. She's super smart, really good. She's a marine geophysicist. And what she can do with her marine geophysics equipment is pull it across the plain and tell us what the rocks and sediments are below the water. And we raised money from National Geographic to pay for her PhD. That's what she did for her PhD. And this is a reconstruction of the geology, okay? So that's the modern coastline right there. And here's the coastline during the glacial. 95 kilometers from Platte to the coastline at that time. And there's a couple of things I'm just going to point out and you can keep in your mind. It was flat. It had these big riverine systems very slowly working their way across that plain. This is a geological map, and I'm not going to go through the details for it, but basically this is a limestone formation here, and this is a mixed shale and limestone formation, and that actually tells us quite a bit about what the vegetation would be. Using those details, we can build a soil map, and that's what the soil map is. And these dark areas are soils, rich soils, and the ones that are lighter are the poorer soils. So basically what you see is here near the coast, the current coast, we had a rich soil environment with lots of water, lots of riverine systems going out. And further away, we had a limestone soil, poor nutrient, but still with these riparian woodlands systems going through it. Then what we did is we partnered with your climate modeling group, which is based in Pretoria and Johannesburg, and they run your South Africa's climate model. So a climate model requires a supercomputer to run, and that's what predicts your weather. South Africa is the only African country that has its own climate model. And we partnered with them and we moved that model to an American supercomputer where we have some excess supercomputer capacity. We loaded the model with the orbital parameters of a glacial phase and ran a simulation of what climate would be like. And we ran some of the sims on your supercomputer network, and we ran some of the sims on our supercomputer network to split the job, because it's extremely costly, right? So those supercomputer simulations cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to run. And these are the 8 simulations that we ran. And I'm not going to explain, what you're seeing here is wind direction. But once we take the climate and the geology, once we take the climate and the geology, we can use what we call vegetation models. And we partnered with Richard Calling, one of South Africa's greatest scientists, right? This is the guy, the world-renowned expert on Mediterranean vegetation, the local specialist on the fynbos, a PhD student of his, Dr. Alistair Potts, and Dr. Janet Franklin. She's an American scientist, and her specialty is these models, how you use climate and soil to project what vegetation looks like. And they projected the vegetation out onto that Paleogallus plain. And I'm going to point out one thing that was important from this. The model showed us that off the coastline, right here, was a savanna ecosystem, savanna grassland, not fynbos. And it was produced by the special conditions of glacial climate and soil that was revealed here. This area right here is limestone fynbos, as you would expect. It's a limestone bedrock. So now we have an answer for why we have zebra and wildebeest and grass-eating animals in our cave sites. When we have glacial phases, people are hunting those animals out here. So if you were at Pinnacle Point, Cave 13B today, and you were looking out the cave, that's what it would look like. And Dr. Eric Fisher, a colleague of mine who's an expert at computer visualization, shows us that that's what it would look like when it was occupied. People would have been looking out on a grassland ecosystem with riverine systems running through it, and much of the time the coast was 10 kilometers away, 5 kilometers away. Only rarely during the maximum glacials was it, 95, right? Okay. Now what we know from our studies of the isotopes of the animals is that during a glacial phase, this is the maximum phase, right? Here's the coast, and here's where it would be, let's say, 18,000 years ago. You already know you have summer rain to the east, and you have winter rain to the west. And we now know that a migration ecosystem existed out on that plain, with animals moving to the east during the summer to chase the green grass there, and then moving to the west in the winter to chase the green grass there. And the people inhabiting these caves hunted those animals on that plain on a seasonal basis. So that's the third leg of this environment for a refuge population. We have the rich coastal shellfish. We have the geophytes underground. And now we can add hunting these big Pleistocene animals out on the exposed continental shelf. And that's what we call a special environment for the evolution of a unique species. We think modern humans evolved here, and they evolved because they found this place to be a refuge during those glacial phases because of that unique confluence of rich food resources. Okay, so now what I want to do is switch to the field work that we've done. And that field work we use to test the ideas that the model building creates, but also to tell us, what was the behavior of the people living at that time. And I put 20 years of research for our team at the top. We started the project in 1999. So we're now at a 20-year, 1999 is the first time I came out to Mossel Bay and looked at those caves. So we're at 20 years. And in red is what our team has produced. Okay? On this axis is time, 175,000 years ago, up to the present. The other sites that you may know about, Blumbos, this is the time range represented there. Colassi's River, and the Zitsakama, the time range represented there. Nelson Bay Cave, here on the Rawberg. And here's the Pinnacle Point Caves. You can see we have the longest, oldest sequence, and we've now begun working at Vleesbaai, which is just to the west, and those are open-air sites. I'm going to talk a little bit about those today. I'm just going to put a plug in. We've expanded our project to Knysna. That's under the direction of Dr. Naomi Cleghorn. She's in her 5th season of excavation at Knysna. And you can see her excavation has closed that temporal gap. We were missing 50,000 to 25, and she's filled that in. And she'd be a great speaker to invite to you, come here and talk to you about her work in Knysna. Because that site is going to be super important. They'll start publishing pretty soon. It takes 5 to 7 years to get going in an archaeological project, so she'll have some very exciting results to tell you as the years go by. And that's what the Knysna Cave looks like. She's digging up here. And it's a very difficult climb to get up there. It's a very challenging field excavation. And when they're digging, everybody's roped in with mountaineering safety gear. Because you make one wrong step and you're falling to your death. Okay. Okay, so let me bring you up to date on what we have at Pinnacle Point. Just to orient ourselves, Pinnacle Point is here. Vleesbaai is this big half-moon bay at this location. The sites that we've spent most of our time excavating at Pinnacle Point are PP13B, which is over here. That's the site that made Pinnacle Point famous. And PP56 North, which is just here. We excavated that site for 12 years. I thought it was going to be a 5-year job, and it more than doubled. I thought it had 5 meters of deposit. It had 15 vertical meters of deposit. So always a surprise. And we will start excavating in PP56 South probably in a couple years. So just to show you what PP13B looks like, this is the cave up here, and this is the view out of the cave. This is our excavations there. We have very advanced excavation technique. Everything is measured with lasers. You won't even find a tape measure on our site. They can measure to more than millimeter accuracy, directly shot to handheld computers. So all of our data is acquired digitally. And PP56 North is a rock shelter. That's a sailcloth that we would pull over the excavations to protect the excavators from rain. You can see our excavators here working with the total stations, measuring materials. And that site dates from 90,000 to 50,000, and we have over 450,000 measured artifacts. So those are measured by laser. And we're now in the part of the project, so we've stopped digging there. I'm not saying we're done. I think we might be done, but we're in a phase in the project where we're analyzing those materials. So what has Pinnacle Point contributed to modern human origins? In 2007, we published this paper in Nature. Nature and Science are our 2 most prestigious scientific journals. And that paper reported on the earliest evidence for people eating seafood. And that dates to about 160,000 years ago. And that's still the oldest evidence for people eating seafood. So that was found at Pinnacle Point. Also at that time, in the 160,000-year-old sediments, we found modified ochre. So these are pigments. And the ochre pieces, if you look carefully, you'll see the lines moving in this direction, and these lines here, and these lines here. Those aren't engravings, okay? There are engravings at Bloembos that date to about 100,000, right? 60,000 years after that. These aren't engravings. They are rather evidence of people rubbing the pigment against a rock to produce a powder. So they're using the powder for something, maybe painting their bodies or rock painting. We're not sure. But it's really clear evidence that people were practicing symbolic behavior. And then in 2009, we had our second major result that was published in Science. And that was that people were using a technology called heat treatment. And heat treatment is when you take a stone that in its natural state is inappropriate for making stone tools, and you heat it under controlled conditions, which partially vitrifies it and then makes it optimal for making stone artifacts. So that's a piece of silkrete. Silkrete is the stone they were heat treating. That's a piece of silkrete heat treated, and that was made from it. That comes from that, right? So they get bright red, they partially vitrify, they get shiny, and then you can make beautiful spear points like that. And what's really important about that is that signals the origins of pyrotechnology. This is when people learned that they could take a material they find in the environment and under controlled heating conditions modify it to make something else. And that's the origins of our technology, right? Metal and steel, and this is the bridging technology to ceramics, which doesn't occur until 12,000 years ago, right? So it was a huge result, right? And then in 2012, we published another major result in Nature. It actually made the front cover. And we documented the earliest microlithic technology anywhere on the planet, dated to about 71,000 years ago. And we now know we can push it back to about 74, actually. And the reason this is important is these little tiny things, which are only a couple centimeters long, they were glued in to pieces of wood and bone to make extra special projectile weapons. They don't look very impressive as they are, right? But when they're mounted into a composite tool, they represent a huge advance in projectile technology. Okay, so the fourth major result I'm going to end the talk with. Okay, these date to about 70,000 years ago. That brings us up to what we call the Great Human Diaspora, right? And we know that modern humans leave Africa around 70,000 years ago. They end up in Western Europe around 45,000 years ago when Neanderthals go extinct. After inbreeding with us a little bit, they make it all the way to Australia 65,000 years ago, and Denisovans go extinct, but we interbreed with them. We make it into the Arctic 45,000 years ago, but there's a lag, and then they make it into North America around 14,000 years ago. So by 13,000 years ago, we're all over the planet except for Antarctica. There's been a huge extinction event of sister species, sister human species. We've driven tons of large mammals extinct in North America and Australia. And that is a huge planet-changing event. And that diaspora dates to a glacial phase, right? We call it marine isotope stage 4. You can see right there. 70,000, 75,000, right in there, people come out of Africa. Now, I tell the story of that in my second Scientific American paper, How We Conquered the Planet. And the subtitle was The Most Invasive Species of All. We often think of other species as we name them invasive, and it's kind of an insult, right? That's that invasive Australian tree. We hate it, we burn it, we poison it. But in fact, we are the most invasive species. And now we're actually going out into space. And I often say if I was an alien and I had been watching the progress of the humans, what I do is I turn my weapons up to 11 and I burn this planet. Okay, so I've given the reasons, and I think that invasive character happened because we evolved a very special form of cooperation. And that cooperation is reflected by what we're doing today. All these unrelated individuals coming together to cooperate. I'm sharing information with you. People were sharing food with me last night and their information. We're the only animal that does that with unrelated individuals, right? Lots of animals do it with kin, but they don't do it with non-kin. It's very hard to explain that biologically with biological theory. And I've offered an explanation in these papers. And if you're interested, I can come back and tell you that story. But let's come back to our archaeological record. And I'm going to end the talk with what we found at PP56 and Vleesbaai that's very exciting. So to remind you, Vleesbaai is within walking distance of Pinnacle Point. Your normal hunter-gatherer group will go out foraging maybe 10, 15 kilometers a day, and then come back to their home base. So one can imagine that hunter-gatherers were living in the caves and the rock shelters at Pinnacle Point, and they were foraging around here, and Vleesbaai is within their foraging radius. So we've been digging at a couple of different areas at Vleesbaai. And there's Pinnacle Point. Here's one of our excavations. You can see it, right? And these sites were occupied when the coast was further away. So they're a little piece of the Paleogallus plain preserved for us here on the coast. And that's another reason why, we're studying them. So this is what some of the sites look like. Here's some of our excavators. These are stone artifacts, and you can see they're beautifully laying flat right on the ground. They're in what we call primary context, so they were directly where they were dropped. Here's a piece plot of all the artifacts, and that's a heat map. And we think we can see 3 people sitting here making stone tools. One was here, and one was here, and one was over here. Here's the vertical plots. Outstanding preservation. Okay. So what I'm going to do is end the talk with our testing of the Toba hypothesis. And you're probably wondering, what is the Toba hypothesis? Toba was a supervolcano that went off with enormous power 74,000 years ago. And here's how big it was compared to ones that you might know. That's Pompeii, Krakatoa. This is Toba. Here's Toba compared to other very large eruptions. Gigantic. If Toba went off today, it is a civilization-killing event. Absolutely. We don't make it through. Some people may survive, but it's a complete collapse of society because of the ejectamenta it throws up into the atmosphere and the long volcanic winter that would create. Okay, so to give you an idea, that's Krakatoa. If I haven't made my point, that's Toba. My favorite actor when I was a kid, Godzilla. Okay, we know its date really, really tightly. Okay, 73.88 plus or minus 0.32 years. That's in what I do, that's a super tight age estimate. And back in 1998, my colleague Stanley Ambrose wrote this paper where he argued that the Toba eruption caused the near extinction of all humans. It was so powerful. And that hypothesis has been around for a long time. And in order to test that hypothesis, since the origin population is here, we have to see how that population responded to Toba. And that's tough to do, okay? But we were able to do it, and I'll explain how. Okay. So can we find Toba, its signature in our archaeological sites, and see if it wiped out people? I started this study in 2005. We never published it until 2018. It took 13 years to accomplish. So this is how we do it. During the Plinian phase of a volcanic eruption, and the Plinian phase is, imagine you shake up a beer can, you pop it open, and right? Short-lived. It throws up these really tiny microscopic glass shards. And those glass shards, you won't even see them, but they're ejected into the atmosphere. They're distributed, hopefully far, and then they come down. But you'll never see them. And what we proposed was it was so powerful, it reached pinnacle point. Almost 9,000 kilometers. Now we know Toba's eruption reached to this point. That's those dots. But we're basically saying, can we find evidence for it double that space? So we started looking. And that's my colleague, Takis Panagiotis Karkanis, great field geologist. And one day he showed me this thin section. This is under a microscope. And you'll see there's a little piece of glass in those bubbles. And those bubbles, he said, I think that's a volcanic shard. Those bubbles are from the superheating of glass. And we should not be seeing those at pinnacle point. There's no volcanic activity in this area. And then I recruited Gene Smith, and he's a specialist at this kind of work. He came out to pinnacle point, did all the analysis. And here's just all the things we have to do. So Gene built a laboratory to do this, but basically what we have to do is float the grains out of the sediment. And once we float grains of all the same weight, we have technicians sit with a microscope and they hand pick them out of that. And then when they see one that they think is a volcanic shard, we mount it on a slide, we hit it with a beam, and if all conditions are right, we can measure its chemistry. And every volcanic activity has a unique chemical signature. So if we can measure its chemistry, we can tell whether it came from Toba or not. So we measured the chemistry of some of them. Each one of these is a grain, okay? And I don't expect you to read this slide, but I just want to show you that there's data that we collect. And each one of these is the percentage of the element represented. And these geochemical signatures then are compared to known volcanic eruptions. So those crosshairs there, shown here, are known Toba shards. And in that diamond shape are the pinnacle point ones. And you can see they fall right on top of Toba. So statistically speaking, we were able to show without doubt that the shards at pinnacle point were from Toba's volcanic eruption. Then what we do, that's only half the job. Then we have to count the shards and figure out where they come in the deposit. So we actually take samples every centimeter and we do the whole process over again. Float out the shards, hand count them, and so on. And then we build up a profile of their occurrence. And they begin right here, right? There's no shards below it. And then we take that shard count, okay, a couple pictures of shards, and we compare them to the overall stratigraphy. Then we studied the sites at Vleesbaai, the open-air sites. And guess what? That's what I showed in this prior slide. At Vleesbaai, we also found volcanic shards and analyzed their chemistry, and they turned out also to be Toba shards. So now we have Toba shards at the caves and the rock shelters and the open-air sites. Okay, so when did that eruption occur? Well, I told you that it's independently dated to 74,000 years ago. And here's the sequence at PP56, okay? Each one of these dots that you see with a line is a date that we attained through a technique called optically stimulated luminescence dating. And that dates the last time a grain of sand was exposed to light. It works good, but it has a large error, and that's what you see there. And so this is the bottom of the site. This is the top of the site. We did 90 OSL dates, and that orange envelope you see there is a Bayesian statistical model showing the best fit age to the stratigraphy. Okay? We found the Toba shards right at this point in our age model. And if we follow that down, our age model predicted those sediments to be 74,000 years ago. So now we have a completely independent test of the age model as created by optical stimulated luminescence. And one of the things we're always doing in science, right, is trying to find independent validation of data. Here we go. Okay, so did Toba create a population crash? Here's the Toba isochron, that red line that you see right there, okay? And this is our stratigraphy, and each one of these dots is a plotted artifact. So if Toba created an abandonment, what we should see is right at that isochron, a big gap in the archaeological finds. You see what I mean? But we don't. And in fact, statistically, after the Toba event, which is right here, the density of occupation at PP56 goes up, not down. So what we're able to show is that here on the south coast, during the volcanic eruption, people survived the Toba event. Okay. Now this record that I'm showing right here is the ice core record, right? Like similar to, but it's a high resolution one, similar to the one I showed you at the beginning of the talk. That's the Toba event in the ice core record. It's recognized by a sulfate spike. And Toba caused a significant environmental change. You can see it right there. So the world was getting cooler, cooler, cooler. Toba hit, and then it goes really, really cold. So despite the fact that Toba did cause a volcanic winter, people here actually thrived through the event. So once again, what we see is that this special environment on the south coast continued to be a refuge during these harsh climate assaults that the human population underwent again and again. Okay. So just to show you where we found the shards at Vleesbaai, here's the archaeological site, and we found the shards just below it. And that's the final thing I'm going to mention is, what's astonishing about this is that the input of shards is a 2-week event. Okay? So what that allows us to say is correlate the open air site to the cave site at a 2-week resolution. Okay? Now, normally, our dates, okay, that's an OSL date, 73.9 plus or minus 4.2. So that's 73,000 years ago, plus or minus 4,000. Normally, we're talking at precisions of plus or minus several thousand years. But the Toba isochron allows us to say this point in that stratigraphy correlates to the cave sites at 2-week resolution. And so we can take that even further and say the people here were the same people in that cave because of that resolution. And in the Paleosciences, that we've never been able to do that. Okay? So we've now built an entire laboratory to continue this work, and we're going to apply it to all of the sites on the south coast to try to create those high-resolution correlations. Okay, so looking into the future, keep a close eye on Knysna. Knysna is going to create some very fascinating results, and you're going to want to hear about them. Vleesbaai, this open-air site, is really providing our first look at what happened on the landscape. All the sites we've been digging are cave sites, where people slept and cooked. We haven't had any open-air sites. Now we have a record. Not only do we have a record, but the Toba result will allow us to provide extraordinary precise correlations between the home sites and the work sites, right? The cave sites and the open-air sites. And more excavations at Pinnacle Point will sample even older sediments. We've test excavated a cave at Pinnacle Point that's even older than the 160,000-year-old one that, that made it famous, PP13B. Now I'm taking a break in my excavation so I can analyze the material, but I'm going to go back to that site in 2 years. And it'll take us many years to really ramp it up. But we're going to have some exciting results from that locality. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Curtis, thank you very, very much. We've got a short time before the lights go off. Okay, questions?
Two very quick ones. Your very first slide starts with a line coming in from the right, before the Eurasia-Africa split.
Right.
Where were the people living who made that split?
Right, yeah. Good question.
And the second question is, some time ago I heard that runoff from Pinnacle Point golf courses was damaging the fossil record. Is that true?
Okay, well let me answer this one first, okay? So, I didn't go to the beginning of the human origin story. I'd still be talking if I did. But there were several out-of-Africa events. We know that there was an out-of-Africa event about 2 million years ago. So hominids made it into the Levant, Israel, that area, maybe up into Turkey a little bit, but it seems to have petered out. Then there was another one probably around 1.8 million years ago. That would have been Homo erectus, if you keep up with the literature on this stuff. Homo erectus made it all the way to China and all the way to Europe. And then Homo erectus was present in Africa too. So that's one of those shared common ancestors back here. So if you can kind of imagine, you had Homo erectus in China, Homo erectus in Europe, Homo erectus in Africa, and Homo erectus, the local populations evolved into all kinds of different lineages, right? Eventually into Neanderthals and Denisovans and so on. And then, okay, so that's what populated the world with our cousins. And then there's the big event, the great human diaspora that that's what I've called it, to give it some drama, for fundraising and stuff like that. And it is dramatic, right? We left Africa and we conquered the planet and totally changed the ecology and the environment. We're still doing that. That's the 70,000-year-old one. Okay, so there's a backstory to this. The water at Pinnacle Point, boy, that goes back long ago. That in 2007, that's when the irrigation was turned on to the greens, and I found it pouring into the cave. And that began a big fight with the developers, which concluded with the water being turned off, some of the greens being moved back, and now we work very cooperatively with the Homeowners Association. So we monitor the water flow every week. One of my employees, so I have a permanent team of local Mossel Bay people, 10 employees. I had to form a company to employ them. All we do is research. And they're all local people that we've trained in what we do. You saw pictures of them. And so I raised money to pay their salaries, and because they're all annual employees. The longest serving one has worked for me for 14 years, Tina. Every week one of them goes out and they check the buckets, pH tests, they check the water level, and if there are things that we're unhappy with, we communicate to the groundskeepers, they dial it back or we discuss it or whatever. So I think we've got it under control. The bottom line is the South Coast is very attractive to people to live in. right? That's why you're all here. Everybody loves it. I do too. That means development. Yet you are sitting on probably the richest record for modern human origins in the world. So we all have to work together to conserve it, but still live, right?
Any other questions?
We can.
Where did Toba occur and how long did it take?
Toba is in Sumatra, so Indonesia, and it erupted. Well, you know, we don't know what the length of the eruption. The Plinian phase is normally pretty quick, you know, like bang, and there's this massive, and then they'll burp and gurgle for a long time. India has Toba ashes that are meters thick, so that the region would have been annihilated. All the way here in Africa, no one would have seen ash. There would have been microscopic, what we call cryptotephra. Tephra is a glass shard from a volcanic eruption. Crypto is invisible. Those would have been coming down. Very few, though. But the people here definitely would have experienced the environmental effect. 30, 40 years of climate change. How dramatic it was, we don't know, but it wasn't dramatic enough to annihilate people, as we've proved. So that paper was also in Nature, and you know, it was a big result. We were the first ones to find the shards in an archaeological site and be able to show a distribution of artifacts across the shard layer.
Sorry. Last question.
Do you know of any published data that compares the genomic comparisons with old African populations? I was thinking of the Ituri pygmies, the Khoi, and the San peoples.
Right. Okay, so he was asking about the genomic information on ancient African lineages. We actually know a lot, and it's published widely. We know that the Khoisan people are genetically the most diverse in the world and are the oldest lineage. And their lineage appears to have appeared about 110,000 years ago. So when I say a lineage appeared, okay, what I mean is that we have a root lineage, right? And one buds off and becomes its own lineage and becomes reproducibly separate. So there's not a lot of gene flow. And we can see that budding off moment in the genome. Okay, so Khoisan people budded off about 110, 120,000 years ago. Pygmies about 60. Hadzapi people, Hadza people who are in Tanzania, they also speak a click language, around 40. So the hunter-gatherer lineages in Africa are the most ancient lineages that we have. And so the fact that the Khoisan people are one of the oldest lineages is again, it's not definitive evidence, but it's suggestive evidence that the origin lineage was somewhere down here. You see what I'm saying? And we don't know if the Khoi people were the people inhabiting these sites. They may very well have been, but we don't know that. At least 160,000 years ago. At 20,000 years ago at Nelson Bay Cave, those were almost certainly Khoi lineage people. And by the Holocene, absolutely. So by 10,000 years ago, those are Khoisan. Thank you, Eston.
Okay, I'm calling on David Hall Green to say thank you to the speaker.
Very, very briefly, and I hope you can hear me, I'm a shy, retiring type of Curtis, you are named by his first name. Curtis, it's been a great privilege for us to have you here in the flesh from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And I think we'll all agree that what we've heard and seen at this lecture is absolutely mind-boggling. And from my own point of view, I mean, I'm, to use a modern expression, gobsmacked at the work, the research, the study over years and years that goes into this kind of discipline. And I think if we can take something away from this, in our troubled world and all that goes on in it, and the splits and the sectarian divisions and so on, dreadful thing that happened recently in New Zealand, it kind of brings it back to all of us that when we think we've got problems, we should look at the big picture and at our commonality as human beings on this planet. So thank you, and thank you for giving us this wonderful opportunity to attend your fascinating presentation. Let's give them a big hand.